Hey, what's up YouTube? Today we are going to create a form using the React Hook form package. In this video, I'm going to take you guys step by step on how to create an advanced multi-step form. In the description below, I am providing the GitHub repository, and you should go to the starter code branch so you could fork over this repo and start where I am when it comes to the certain packages and versions needed for this tutorial. Also, if you look down in the description of this video, there is a link to my landing page where you can enter your email for early bird pricing and early bird access to a paid course that we're going to come out with in the next few months. And this is going to be a lifetime access deal, one-time fee. And these videos are going to be tutorials like you see on YouTube, but in a lot more detail and a lot more advanced. So I recommend putting your email in. There's no sign up required. Just become part of the newsletter so you get updates when this course gets released. Before we actually start coding, I do want to showcase the form that we're going to create for this specific tutorial. This is going to be the exact form that we are going to build inside of this video. As you can see, it is a job application multi-step form with 5 different steps. Number 1, personal information, 2, address, 3, work experience, 4, social links, and 5, resume. To build this form, we're using the form component from ShadCN, which utilizes the React Hook form library and Zod. Zod is a library that allows us to do client-side and server-side validation on forms and inputs. So if we try to go to step 2 without filling out any of these inputs, we are going to get met with some client-side validation. So it's going to check for the types in the input. It is also going to see if it's a required input or not. And it's also going to display a custom error message to the user. Let's fill out this information so we can satisfy the validation on the client side to move to step 2. And for the phone number, let's click United States because that's where I'm from. And let's type in a fake number so you guys don't prank call me here in the future. So let's click next and go to step 2 of the form. On this address section, we did add a special feature. As you can see, this button here, this button is using the geolocation API from your device. So as long as it's enabled on the user's device, you're going to be able to click this button and it is going to pre-populate the country and the zip code that they're currently in based on the user's device. So this is a cool little feature that you could always add to a form. But for now, let's just add some random address. Let's click the state. So I'm in the United States, and say if I'm in Florida, what it's going to do, it's going to see that we selected Florida, and then it's going to look at a JSON data. And as long as Florida is selected, it's going to look at every city within Florida. So for example, if you select, say Delaware, it's going to look at only cities within Delaware. So we're just going to put Camden, Delaware. And then the time zone is also going to be based off of your specific device and is going to pre-populate the time zone. And I am in America/New York. That is my time zone. If you're in a different time zone, your time zone should automatically pre-populate here. For section 3 of the form, it is the work experience, and this is where you could add your work experience, and all you have to do is click add job, and we are utilizing specific hooks that React Hook form allows us developers to use, which we'll go over later in this video. So job number 1, let's just put a random title. Let's put developer. Let's put company ABC Inc. as a random company. We could put from, as you can see, we have a calendar pop up, October 1st, and say we just got let go 2 days ago or a week ago. And then we could put a description, developed and maintained their code base. And then what you can do too is you could add another job if you want, or you could just remove this job and restart your job description again inside of the work experience tab. So let's go over to the next section. And this section is pretty cool as well. This is for the social links. So when you usually apply for a job, they usually ask for some social links like your Facebook, maybe your GitHub profile if you're applying to be a developer or software engineer. So for example, let's say if we put my GitHub profile link. So if you go to GitHub, go to your profile, we copy the link here on your profile and we're going to paste it here. And then what it does a fetch to a GitHub API to fetch some data from this specific user. So as you can see here, we're displaying it in a very neat and modern way. And we're going to do the same thing for the personal portfolio. So for any website link we have, so this is usually a website you create that you showcase your projects on. So for me, I could just do mine, which is called devvibestudio.com. I'm just going to copy this link, paste it here, and we are fetching the data to be displayed here as well. So we're going to show you exactly how to do this within this video and display these to make your form even better and above everybody else's. So let's go over to the last section, which is the resume. And what we're using here is we're using the React Drop Zone library. It is a package, and we will go over exactly how to implement it within a form. All we could do is we could either drag and drop files here, or we could click to select some files. So let's click and select a file. So let's use my resume here. And as you can see, when we upload it, it will display here, pretty much saying it's successfully uploaded, or we could click X right here if we messed up and do a different one. So say if we want to do this PDF instead, it is going to show here. So we are also checking to make sure that the right file is being uploaded in here. And if the wrong file is uploaded, we are going to display an error message. So this is the 5-step form that we're going to create within this video. And all you do is when you click submit, so let's just open up the DevTools and go to the console. All we're doing is we are console logging all of the values, as you can see here in the console. So in this video, we're not going to go over the server action part. This video is specifically for the React hook form and how to create a very modern, sleek, and advanced form using this package. So before we start coding, we do want to clone the repository that you're going to find in the description below this YouTube video. And you're going to want to make sure you're on the starter code branch, not the main branch. You want to be on the starter code branch if you want to follow along with the video. And the reason why we have a starter code is because there's going to be some files that it isn't necessary for me to explain what they are, because it has nothing to do with React hook forms or anything related to this video, but it is going to help us create the form that you just saw in that showcase. So what we're going to do is when we're in that branch, we're going to click the green code button and we're going to use the HTTPS method, and we're just going to copy the URL to clipboard. So now we have that inside of our clipboard. Next is you're going to open up your terminal, and what you want to do is you want to change directories into wherever you usually have your projects. So for me, that is going to be inside of my projects area. And what I'm going to do here is I am going to make a new directory, and we are going to call this React Hook Form Tutorial, or call it whatever your project name is. Next is we're going to change directories into that folder. And I am going to run the command code dot to open up my VS Code. So that's my text editor, my code editor. And now I'm going to bring that to the screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the terminal here, the built-in terminal. I'm going to zoom in so you guys can see everything better. And what we are going to do here is we're going to run the command git clone what we copied space period. So that means it's going to clone the repository within the current folder, which is the one we just created. So we're going to press enter. And as you can see, it did clone everything in here. So you're going to have a source folder with a app folder, a components folder with some UI components, and a lib folder with 4 different files. So that's what you should pretty much get with the cloned repository. And another thing I want to do is I want to delete this components.json because we're going to reinitialize ShatCN just in case. And another thing we have to do is we have to install everything from this package JSON, because at the moment we do not have a node modules folders. To get that, just run the command npm I, and you're going to be getting a node modules folder with all of the necessary dependencies required for the project. Now we do want to initialize ShatCN, and to do that, go to the documentation and installation tab, and we're using Next.js, and we're going to run this init command right here, npx ShatCN at latest init. We're going to copy it, go back to our code, and what we're going to do, let me just clear everything so you can see easier. Run the command, and it is going to prompt you to a few questions that we need to answer for the styling. So what style would we like to use? We're going to use New York. The color we're going to use for base color is neutral. And would you like to use CSS variables for theming? We're going to click yes. And what it is going to do, it is going to tell us that we're using React 19. So depending on when you're watching this video, it might throw this error, it might not. And it's going to say some packages may fail due to install to pure dependency issues and npm. So how would you like to proceed? We are going to use the legacy pure deps. So it's going to install the dependencies, and what it's going to do, it is going to create your components.json file again, which is pretty much connecting ShadCN to your actual Tailwind file and your project. And it also updated one file. So it's going to update your source libutils.ts file. And what that means is it pretty much erased all the code from the repository that we had in here and replaced it with this. So what we need to do is we need to actually go back to the repository, go inside the source folder, go inside the lib folder and the utils file. We are going to copy this whole file here, go back, and we are just going to repaste it back in the utils.ts file. So now our project is ready with the starter code, our packages are updated, and we are ready to use ShadCN as well. Okay, so the first step I want to do in creating this form is I want to define the specific data types for each input. And to do this, we're going to create a schema file using the Zod library. Let's create a schema folder inside of the source directory. And inside of the schema folder, we are going to create a schema.ts file. This is where we're going to define all of the data types for our input on the multi-step form. To figure out what data types we want for a specific input, all we have to do is go back to our localhost 3000 and we can look at each input individually. So as you can see, the first name is the first input, and this is going to be of type string. So that is how we're going to be able to figure out what validation we need using Zod inside of our schema.ts file. Let's head over back to our code, and inside the schema.ts file, let's import Z from Zod. So it's going to be just like this, and let's create a variable called form schema, and let's define how our form is going to look based on the data types. So we're using a z.object from Zod, and what we're going to do is define the first one, which will be the first name. And the first name is going to be a z.string. And then also we could do a bunch of different other things. As you can see, here are the other options that we could do. And what we want to do next is the min. So min means the minimum amount of characters, the minimum length that the string needs to be. And for our case, we are going to do 2. And then what we can do is we could add a custom message if it doesn't meet this criteria. So if they do 1 character, they are going to get this on the client side saying first name must be at least 2 characters long. And then also too, we could add a .max, and this .max we could put as 70 characters long. So it's going to display this message, first name must be at most 70 characters long. Okay, the next one is going to be last name, and what for the last name, we are just going to do the same exact thing that we did for the first name. So same exact thing. And what you saw there that auto-completed my code was called GitHub Copilot. It's a paid extension, so if you guys are interested, do a Google search and see if it will fit your coding needs. Let's now define the data type for email. So we're going to type in email, and this is going to be a little different because we do want to do additional validation for this specific property. So as you can see, Copilot is suggesting a string and email, but we're going to actually take this a step further. We are going to create a variable, and we're going to name this variable email validation schema. You can name this whatever you want, but now we have to define this constant up here. So we're going to say const email validation schema, and now we could define the schema type for email validation. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do z.string, and then we're going to do .email, so because it has to be of type email as well. And then we're going to introduce this Zod method called super refine. This allows you to provide custom validation on top of your schema type. The super refine method is going to be an anonymous callback. So it is going to be in a synchronous function. And the 2 arguments this is going to take in is going to be the value. That's the first one. And our value is going to be email. because that is what we're checking for. And the second one is going to be the CTX, and this is going to be an object that is specifically from Zod. And what this does, it has a add issue method, which is going to trigger any registration validation issues. So if the validation isn't correct, it's going to throw that ctx.addIssue, and it is going to say that this data type is incorrect. So that is coming from the Zod library. We're going to make this an anonymous function. And the first check we are going to do is we're going to check if the email is a temp email or not. So a temporary email is just an email that's created by people, which it's not the real email account, and they just want to quickly sign up and create an account on a certain platform or software. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to name a variable called isAvailable. You can name this variable whatever you want. And what we're going to do with this variable is we are going to call a function called isValidEmail, right? And this isValidEmail is coming from the lib folder and the utils file. So that is from the starter code. So what we can do is let's go inside of the isValidEmail, and all this is, it is a synchronous function that takes the email in as an argument, and we have a try catch, and we are calling a API from open.kickbox.com, and we're passing an email as a query string. And what this is doing, it's checking to see if it's a temp email or not. And then we are getting a response back. And if it is, we return false. And if it's not, then we return true. So what we can do here is we could pass in the argument email, which is what we're checking for. And then we could say if it's a falsy value. So if it is not available, what we are going to do is we're not going to do this. Copilot was wrong. What we're going to do is we're going to do ctx.addIssue, and then it's going to be an object. And what this object takes, it could take the code like this. And what we can do for the code is we could do custom. So this could be a custom code, doesn't matter. And then we're going to do a message. And the message we're just going to say is email is not valid. So that is the first check we're going to do for the email validation schema. Second check we are going to do is we're going to see if the email has an addition sign. So to do that, we're going to say if there is an email. So if we get an email through this specific email validation schema and inside of the super refine method. So if there's an email that exists, we're going to say const has add sign like this, whatever variable you want to name it. It's going to equal the email.includes. And what this is going to include is going to include the plus sign like this. So if this is true, that means we're going to throw an issue, right? And to do that, Copilot is suggesting this. So if this is true, it's going to throw email should not contain a plus sign. So that is perfect. And what we're going to do is we're going to close this. And we are going to go to the next validation check, which is we're going to make sure that it isn't a subdomain email as well. So we're going to be inside the same if statement right here. So underneath this yellow bracket. And what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable called const is subdomain email. And this is going to equal to email.split. And where I'm getting this specific function that I'm writing here from is ChatGPT. I asked it to write a JavaScript methods and functions to see if the email is a subdomain email or not. So this is coming from ChatGPT, and I recommend doing a bunch of stuff like that as well. So they're trying to suggest this, but we're going to also have a dot split, and we're going to split it from the period, and then dot length is going to be greater than 2 like this. So if this becomes true, that means it is a subdomain email. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an issue as well. And with a custom message saying email should not contain subdomains. And now let's add the last bracket. And this is a custom validation for the email. So this is adding additional validation instead of just doing it like this. So now we have the email validation complete. The next data type we want to define is going to be phone. So we're going to put a comma. It'll be phone. And for the phone, we are going to use a library called React Phone Number Input. And this is going to have a function to make sure if it's a valid phone number or not. So first, it's going to be a z.string like this. And then we are going to have a .refine method, which allows us to do additional data type checking. And what we can do in this is we are going to have a function as the first argument, which we are going to call is valid phone number. And this is coming from React phone number input. And this should have been installed when you had your starter code inside of your package.json file. And then what we're going to do here is we are going to have a comma, and then we're just going to do an error message just in case there is an issue with this validation. And what we're going to say is we'll have a message, and the message is going to say invalid phone number. So this function that we just have here is going to check to see if this is a valid phone number or not. For the properties after phone, it's going to be country, state, city, address, and zip. And all of these are going to be very similar to the first name and last name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these over and just paste them. There's no reason for me to type these all out manually. So here we go. So we have country, state, city, address, and zip. And the only difference is zip does have a regular expression or a regex. And this is the expression that it needs to match. So the zip code needs to match in this specific format. And the zip code must be between 4 and 10 digits. Time zone is the next property. And for time zone, we are going to have this as a z.string. And we're also going to have it as optional. And the reason why is because we are going to be fetching from their device to see what time zone they're in so they don't have to input it manually. The next data type we're going to define is going to be jobs. And the jobs is going to be an array of jobs. So it's going to be a z.array. And we are wanting to do further an additional validation. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a variable called job schema. So we're going to get an error because we haven't defined this yet. So let's go up here and define it. So we're going to say const job schema. And this is going to equal to a z.object. And we have to define what's going to be in each job as a data type. So what do we want to know from the person filling out this form about their previous job experience? So first we want to know their position. So like title, this could be a z.string. And then we could have a .min with a minimum of 2 characters. And then we could also have a .max with 70 characters. Another thing we want to know is we want to know what company they worked for. So this could be literally the same thing, a minimum of 2, and we could do a max of like 90. And you could always change these values to whatever you want. I'm just putting some right now for the video's sake. We're also going to know when they worked. So from what date to what date. So this is going to be a z.date as the type. And the 2, this is going to be a z.date as well. Another thing is we need to know the description. So
market data connection loss
is what they did like on a day-to-day basis. We want to know so they could describe it. So this is going to be a z.string with a minimum of 2, and we can do a maximum of 500 characters. So this is the basic data type of the job schema, but we do want to do additional validation. So we can add the .refine method at the end. And what this is going to take in is going to take in a anonymous function, and we are going to pass in the data as an argument. And the data is the title, the company, the from, and the to in the description. So we're going to say if there is no data, and if you put dot, you're going to be able to see all of the properties you just defined.
Market
so
data connection reestablished.
Or there's no data.to. So that means they didn't even fill out on the calendar when they worked, from what date to what date. Or we're going to check to see if the data.from is less than or equal to the data.to. That means that they worked, they have the dates mixed up, and technically it won't make any sense. And we need to make sure we validate this and send them an error message if that happens. So what we're going to do is we are going to have a message. And for this message, we're going to say from date should be less than the to date, just like this. And so this is going to be an array of the job schema, just like that. And then next, you could add a .min as well here. So we're going to add a .min. So we want them to at least fill out one job schema. So we're going to do .min of 1. And what we could do here is we could do an error message saying message, at least one job should be added. Let's define the data type for the GitHub input. So we want to know their GitHub. And for this, we want to have a GitHub with a z.string. That is going to be a string, and it's also going to be a .url because it's going to be a URL that we're taking into the input. And what we can do here is we could just send a message saying that this is an invalid input, no, URL format, my fault, URL format. So that's what it's checking for, this .url. Let's put a comma here to get rid of that error. Let's also add another dot notation to the end of this. And what we're going to do here is we're going to use the refine method to add additional validation. It's going to take in a function, and what we could do is we could take the URL, and what we could check is to see if the URL includes GitHub. So the URL.includes, and then we're going to just say GitHub, because the URL that we're fetching is going to have GitHub in the URL. And then we could define a error message as well. So the error message should be URL should be a GitHub profile. Let's define the data type for the resume input. This one is going to be a little different than the previous ones. This is going to be of type zArray. And I want to do additional validation checks. So instead of doing it on this same line, we are going to create a variable called resume validation schema, just like this. And what we're going to do is I'm going to copy and paste code and explain what's going on. This is going to be doing all of the checks for the resume inside of this variable, and I'm going to do right above the form schema object. So let me copy and paste this all over. And there's going to be a few errors. All we have to do is import these, and these util functions and types, they're going to be inside of your lib folder that was inside of the starter code. So let's just import these at the top. So as you can see, all of these are helper functions that are stored inside of the lib folder. And you guys can look at that lib folder and just understand what's going on more, but let's just keep going on with the validation schema. So this is going to be instance of file. So that means it's going to be a type of file. We're using the super refine method, and it takes in as argument the file and the CTX object. So we're saying if the file size is less than or equal to 0, then we are going to use the CTX object and the add issue method on top of that object. So we could display a validation error message, right? And then also we're going to say if the file size is greater than the max resume size in bytes. So if you look at what this variable is, it's up here. We pass it the convert metrics to bytes. We pass a value and what we want to convert to it. And you can see the function by going inside where this function is defined. And then we're also saying to make sure if the file type that they uploaded is the correct file type with the correct extension. So this is what this one's doing. So we're doing 3 checks. Make sure there's a file there, make sure it's not above the max file size in bytes, and also to make sure it's the correct file type as well. So that is going to be the checks for the resume. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do a comma, and then we're going to have one more field, which is going to be the portfolio. So this is also just going to be the portfolio link. So this is going to be a z.string, and it's also a URL. So as you remember, I paste in my devvibestudio.com. All it is URL, and we're going to throw an error message if it's not, saying invalid URL format. And then at the bottom, let's export the type form schema. So, and we're going to equal to the z.infer method like this, and it is going to be type of form schema. So this is going to complete the schema.ts file. And if you do want to see this code, it is going to be in the GitHub repo under the main branch. So it's under the main branch and not the starter code branch. So let's move on to creating the form now. We are going to create the form on the main homepage, and the main homepage is just the page.tsx file inside of the app directory. So the code in there is just the boilerplate Next.js home landing page when you build a Next.js project. So we're just going to select all, and let's just backspace, and let's just do an export default function home. and we're going to return a simple div. And inside of this div, we are going to create a component called application form. And this div, we are going to give some Tailwind CSS classes to. We're going to say the max width is going to be screen XL. We're going to have margin left and right of auto, and we're going to have a padding of 4. So now let's create this application form component. And what we can do is inside of the source directory, we are going into the components folder. We are going to create another folder, and we're going to call this application form. And then inside of this application form, we are going to have a form.tsx. So this is going to be our pretty much main file for the form. So let's create a form.tsx file. And inside of this form.tsx file, all we can do is a RIFCE. And this is a ES7 snippet to create a arrow function, a quick arrow function. And we're going to name this application form, the component application form. We're going to go back to our page.tsx, and we're just going to import it at the top. So now if we go to our home page, so let's open up our dev server. So npm run dev. We should be able to see this component render the JSX in here, which is just a text with a div called application form. So let me just make sure localhost 3000 opens up. Let's go over to localhost 3000. And as you can see here at the top, we have an application form, and we do have some Tailwind CSS styling with like the max width of 2XL and stuff like that, and the MX auto. So everything is good. Let's set up the form. So let's actually start creating the foundation of our form. And to do that, we need to start using the React Hook form package. And the first thing we need to import is the useForm. And this is going to come from React Hook form. So useForm is a custom hook for managing forms with ease. It's only going to take one object as an optional argument. And since we are using a hook, which is the useForm hook, we do need to make this a use client page because this is Next.js. So this is going to be client side because it's using a hook. Okay, so to initialize this hook, we need to say const form equals useForm. And like I said, it takes in an object as an optional argument. The first property we are going to use is the resolver. So it's going to be resolver like this. And the resolver pretty much is a function that allows you to use any external validation library. And we are using Zod as a validation library. So this is going to allow us to use it inside of the React Hook form package. So what we can do here is we could say Zod resolver like this, and it is going to take in the form schema. And the form schema is coming from that schema file we just worked on. So if we come up here, we could see export const and then the form schema. So all of the types of the form that we defined. So that's why you should always start with defining your data structure before actually creating your form. And then you could reiterate any of these structures as you need throughout the project. So the Zod resolver, we need to import this at the top. And this is going to come from a different package. So Zod resolver like this. And this is going to come from at hookform /resolvers/Zod. So this isn't the only validation library that you have to use. You could use other ones like Yup or Joy, Beast, and they have one called AJV. The next property we are going to define inside of the useForm properties is going to be called default values. So this, we are going to say what the default values of the form should be. So usually it's going to be an empty string. So for the first one is going to be the first name, and this is going to be of empty string. Next one is going to be last name, and this is going to be of empty string. And there's one reason why we're actually not getting the autocomplete, and that is because after the use form, we need to define the types that we are going to return from this form. So what I want to do is I want to say form schema type like this. And you're probably wondering where this form schema type is. If you actually look inside of your schema.ts file, at the bottom, I changed the export type to form schema type. The reason why is because this was the same name as the form schema, and we can't do that. So that's why I just want to change it to form schema type, just so you guys know. So now, if you do hover over the form, it kind of shows you all of our schema right here. And then if we press enter and then press space, and now we can see everything that we should be using inside of the default values. So the next thing is going to be the email, which is going to be an empty string. We are also going to have phone, right, which is going to be of empty string. We're going to have country, state, city, address, zip. We're also going to have jobs, which is going to be an empty array. We're going to have GitHub, empty string, portfolio, which is just the URL link, and it's going to be an empty string. And then the time zone was the optional one. So as you can see, it had a question mark. The time zone, we are going to want to fill in for them. This is just an extra thing to make your form a lot more user-friendly. And we're going to use a JavaScript function. It's going to be until date time format. And then it's going to be the rest of this. And then resolved options time zone. So what this is doing, it is taking the time zone from the user's device and just inputting it as the value for the time zone property here. So that is going to be the default value inside of the form. So that's why it's optional. And we are going to make sure that the input is disabled so they can't change it. So now that we have the data structure for the form completely filled out, now let's create each individual step and how each individual step should be structured as well. So to do that, above this function, let's call export type and then step like this. So we're defining the step type, and each step is going to have an ID, and this is going to be of string. We are also going to have a title, which is going to be of type string. We are going to have a description. This is also going to be of type string. We're going to have a component. So this is going to be the component for this specific step that is going to render to the user. This is going to be a function that returns a react.jsx element, just like this. And then we're going to have inputs. So these are going to be the inputs for the specific step. And what the input type, it's going to be the key of, key of form schema type array. So the form schema type, it's going to look at this, and it's going to look at all of this inputs, and it's going to match up the keys of the inputs to the values that we define here in the inputs. So for example, let's create our first step. So to do that, we are going to create a variable called steps, and this is going to be an array of objects, and the first step has to follow this data structure, right? So we're going to have an ID, and we can just do this of 1. It's a string. We're going to have a title, which is actually personal information. We are also going to have a description, and this description can be just tell us about yourself. We're going to have a component that we have to render for this specific step. We could call this personal information for now, but right now it's going to be thrown an error because we don't have this component made. And the last step is going to be the inputs, right? And the inputs for the first specific step is going to be the first name, the last name, the email, and the phone. So what this is going to do, it is going to look in the form schema type, and it's going to look at the keys. So the keys is first name, last name, email, phone, and is going to match these up here. First name, last name, email, and phone, and it has to be of a literal type. So it has to make sure it exactly matches the values that we're getting from the form schema type, because that is what the key of type does. So now, just to get rid of this red squiggly, let's create this personal information component. And what I'm going to do is inside of the application form folder, let's create another nested folder called steps. And inside of the steps, let's create a file called personal information.tsx. Let's use RAFCE. Let's rename it to make sure it's capital. And all we have to do is we're already exporting it. So let's import it here so we get rid of this error. Perfect. So now all we need to do is we need to add the remaining 4 steps, which makes it 5 steps in total. And then we need to create each component inside of the steps folder. And then we are good to go with the steps. So I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to quickly do that. And we're going to come right back. I'm done doing all these steps. As you can see, I have step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all in the same data structure. And if you're not doing it in the same data structure, you're going to get an error thrown at you because we are defining the type. And at the end of the steps, make sure you just add the satisfy step as an array, just like that. So it's going to make sure it's checking these types against your variable steps here. So you could hover over this and you can see exactly what steps are needed. So for example, ID string, title string, description string, component, and then the inputs is going to be first name, last name, email, phone. And then as you can see, it's doing it for that. And then it's showing them for all of them as well. Okay, perfect. So now let's go down to where we are displaying the UI to our client or the user. And what we are going to do is let's just remove this application form right here, this text. And we are going to use the form component from Shatsian. So we already have that inside of our project. So this is going to come from /UI/form. And inside of the form, we are going to pass through all of the properties of the useForm hook. So it's ... It's a spread syntax, spreading through all the properties and methods of the form, which we are defining here from the useForm hook. Perfect. Next is we want to have a HTML form inside of here. And inside of the HTML form, we are going to have it on submit. So this is going to be called when the function is submitted, but we want to call it submitted through the useForm hook. And the way to do that is we use the form dot, and there's a handle submit method on it like this. And what this is going to do, it is going to take in a function as an argument. So what we can do is we could create the onSubmit function like this, and we could define an onSubmit function right here. So const onSubmit. And what this is going to take in, it's going to take in the values. So you can name this whatever you want. We'll name it values. And it's going to be of type form schema type. So we're going to make sure that it matches this specific data structure. And then all we're going to do is console.log the values to make sure that we're getting it inside of this function. And this is where you would call your server action to make sure you can upload it to your database or do anything that you need when it comes to server side. Okay, and then after that, let's scroll back down and let's just add some Tailwind CSS classes to this. We're going to have a space Y of 8. Let's have a height of SVH. Let's have a padding top and bottom of 20, flex call, and let's have a justify between. Okay, and then we are going to work on the inside of this form, displaying how the form is going to look. But before we do that, we are going to work on creating a form controls provider, which is going to use the useContext hook from React, and we're going to create context so that all of the steps in our form can have access to a specific state and its value. The reason we are going to create this context provider and store state in a global way so all of the components can have access to it and not just one is because we don't want to pass it through props. That's going to get really messy. So we need to make sure it is managed in a global way so all the components have it. And the reason why is because if you actually look at our example, we have this header. So this is the form header, and it has all the different steps listed at the top, right? So these are going to be the steps title. And then we also have this back button and this next button. And we need to be able to store the current page index so we could actually properly manage the buttons as well. So let's go back to the code. And what we are going to do is we are going to create a hooks folder inside of the application form. So a hooks like this. And inside the hooks, we are going to create a file called useForm.tsx. And the reason why we're doing it this way is because we're going to create the context, and we're also going to create a custom hook that allows us to access the values of the context using the useContext hook from React. So let's start with defining the interface for the form controls context props. So this is going to be all of the properties and values inside of the context. So let's do interface, and we can name this form controls context props. And what we're going to have here is we're going to have the current page index, and all this is going to be important because we need these values to work on the header and the footer of our form. So this is going to be a number, and let me just copy over the rest so I don't have to type it out and explain what's going on. So what we have here is we have the current page index, we have the historic page index or the previous page index. We have the delta, and the delta is just going to be the current page index minus the historic page index. And what this is going to do, we're only going to use this because we are using Framer Motion. So it's a library that allows us to create animations for our UI. And when you click on the next step, there is going to be a small animation from either the left to right or right to left, depending on if you're going forward or backwards. And the delta is going to let us know if we're clicking the next button or the previous button. The other thing is we're going to have a has next page. It's Boolean, so it's going to be true or false. And if it has the next page, we're going to show the button. And if it doesn't, we also are going to show the submit button. So that means you're on the last page of the form and we need to submit the form. Has a previous page button, same thing, just in reverse. We're going to have an is final page button, and is final page state. And this is going to obviously say if it's the final page or not. And then we're going to have a few functions here. We're going to have a handle next, a handle back. We're going to set the current page index. We're going to set the historic page index, and we're also going to actually set the page. So now let's create the context. We're going to create a form controls context. Let's make sure we're spelling this right. And this is going to equal create context. And this is going to be imported from React. And let's define the type here. It's going to be the form controls context props or undefined. And initially it is going to be undefined, right? Just like this. So this is creating the context, storing it inside of this variable. Next thing we want to do is we want to pass some props into the provider so we can access it throughout all of our components. So to do that, we're going to have an interface called form controls provider props. And the main values we need inside of it is we are obviously going to need the children. So this is going to be of type React.React node. And then we are also going to need the steps. So the steps is going to be like step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is going to be of type step array, like this. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we want to now create the form controls provider. So this is going to be wrapping our whole form. So our whole form has access to all these values. This is going to be a React.functional component like this. And then we're going to have angle brackets, and we're going to say form controls provider props. And yep, that's correct. We are accepting inside of the parameters the children and the steps, which is what we define here. So you can see everything looks good. And next is we are going to now create the states so we can actually create them here with the functions as well. So then we could pass them in as a value and access them anywhere within our component. So I'm going to copy over the first two states, be a little quicker. So all we have here is we're using the useState hook from React, and we are going to set the current page index and the historic page like this with the initial value of 0. Next is let's do the delta. So the delta is going to be the current page index minus the historic page index. So for example, say if the current page index is 0, the historic, or say if the current page index is 1 and the historic page index is 0, it's going to be 1 minus 0. And then we are going to be able to use this value to determine if the page is going forward or if you're going backwards. So if the current page index is 2 and you click back, and then the historic page index is 1, so it's 2 minus 1, or it could be vice versa, 1 minus 2, and it'll be negative. You guys will understand the delta a little better when we actually use it in the form header, so it'll be a lot easier to understand. So now let's define our first function, which is handling the next button. So handle next, it's going to say if the current page index is triple equal to the steps.length minus 1, then we are going to return. So the steps.length is going to equal the length of all the steps. So if we come over here, the steps is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the length is 5, and then we're going to do minus 1, which is 4. And the current page index, if the current page index is the last page, which will be 4 because indexes start at 0, then that means we're just going to return, and there's not going to be a handle next button because that means we're on the last page. Then also too, if we click the handle next button and this check passes, we are going to set the current page index to the current page index plus 1. So if you're on page 0 and you go to page 1, it's going to be 0 plus 1, and that means you are on index number 1, which is page 2. And we're also going to set the historic page index to the page you were just on, which is the current page index. So we're also going to have a function for the handle back button, and it's going to be the same as this, but just in reverse. We are also going to have a function for setting the page. So we have a set page, which takes in the index as the argument. So if the index equals the current page index, we're just going to return. And if the index is greater than the current page index plus 1, we also are going to return. And then you're just going to set the current page index to the index and set the historic page index to the page you were just on. And then we're going to have a few other values here as well. Let's paste those in. Has next page, has previous page, and is final page. So they're pretty self-explanatory. You can look at this code and see exactly what it's doing. But let's move on to actually creating the provider, which is going to wrap everything and pass in the values. So what we're going to have is we're going to have a form controls context dot provider like this, and it is going to take in a value, and this value is going to be an object, and we are going to pass in all of the state, right? The state we just defined, or the variables that we want to have access to throughout the form. So let's close this up, and then it is going to wrap all of the children like this. So these values are going to get passed into all of these children, and you're going to understand how this works a little bit more in a second if you don't understand the React context. But we're going to also create a hook so we can access all of these states and values. So we're going to use the form controls. We're going to call useFormContext, and this is going to be form controls context props. And what this is going to do is we're going to say context equals the use context hook from React. And what we get to pass in here is the form controls context. So the one we just created up here. So right here, we are creating the context, and then we're using it here using the use context hook. And we should do a check. So we're going to say if there's no context, we're going to just throw a new error saying the use form controls must be used within the form controls provider. And then after this, let's just return the context. Okay, so this is going to be our custom hook that we're using to access the values. And this is the provider that we are going to wrap the whole form with. So now let's go to the form. And instead of using this div, we are going to just backspace this, and we're going to use the form controls provider, right? Like this. And let's just make sure the closing tag matches up with that name. And this says property steps is missing, and the reason why is because we're passing it as a param. So let's pass in the steps values into the provider. So if we go into the provider, we are accessing the steps right here. And then we're using like the steps.length method to create some of these functions so we can actually put logic onto the handle next button or the previous button as well. So now our whole form is wrapped with some context, and we have access to all the values as well. At the moment, nothing should be rendering on your localhost 3000, and there should be no errors as well. But the next thing is, let's start actually creating inside the form. So if we look at what we're going to create, we have the header, we have the actual form, and then we have the form footer with the buttons. So what we want to do is we want to create the form header component and then write the code in a different file. It'll be a lot cleaner, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in these steps because we need to have access to these steps so we can display the steps title and just use these steps as well for logic use. So what we're going to do inside of the application form, we are going to create a new file called form header.tsx. And what we're going to do is RAFCE, rename this to form header. And what this is going to do, it's going to take in some props. It's going to be the steps. And then steps is going to be of type step array, like this. And then what we could do here is we could just make sure we import it here so everything is good. And now we have no errors, and we can start working on the form header as well. The form header is going to utilize two hooks, and one of the hooks is the useForm controls, which we created inside the useForm.tsx. And the other hook is going to be the useFormContext. And this is coming from React hook form. And this is going to be a custom hook that allows us to access the form's context. So this is pretty much intended to be used in like deeply nested structures like we are here. Instead of passing the props, we could just use this and access some context from the form. And then one of the main things we're going to be using is the trigger function. And this is going to manually trigger the form or the input validation. So we want to make sure that the inputs are validated before we actually go to the next step. So this trigger function is going to allow us to trigger a validation before moving on to the next step. So let's actually go inside the form header and let's start working on it. I'm going to copy over some stuff as well and explain, but we are going to type some code as well too. So first we are going to use the form controls hook. We need to get the current page index, and then we also need to set the page, right? And we are going to use form controls as the hook, and we are just going to call this. Make sure it's invoked. The next hook we're going to use is going to be, like I said, it's going to be the useFormContext. And it's coming from React hook form. And we are going to use angle brackets, and we are going to say that the type is going to be form schema type, and then invoke the function as well. And inside of here, if you press Control space, you can see all of the different functions and methods you can use from the useFormContext. But what we're going to use is we're going to use trigger. And then we also want to display the error state, so that we're going to use the form state. And the form state actually has an object. And in this object, it has all of these properties that you can use in methods as well. And what we're going to do is we're just going to use errors like this. Okay. Next is let me copy over the JSX part, and then you guys could pause the video or get it from the GitHub repository, but I'm going to explain some of it. Let me just copy this over. So what we're doing here is, let me just press Control S to format it better. We have a parent div with some Tailwind CSS classes, and we are getting these steps from the props, and all I'm doing is mapping through it, and I'm using the index and the step. So this is the value of each step, and the index is obviously the index through a map. And we are storing the is enabled if the index is greater than the current page index plus 1, or if the index is equal to the current page index. And then we're also storing the has error, so step.inputs.sum. If we're saying the keys have some errors or they're undefined, we're going to say it has an error. So this is going to access all of our inputs inside these steps. So if you look back at our steps, we have these inputs. If there's an error within these inputs, we're just going to store here, and this is going to be a Boolean, and it's going to return true. Next is let's import some of these packages. So we have Toast, and we're going to use Sonar, and this is from shadcn. We also have cn, which is going to allow us to dynamically render Tailwind CSS. And then we have this motion.div, which is from Framework Motion, and it just gives animations to our UI like this. So all of the errors should be fixed. And like I said, we're mapping through all the steps. And then what we're returning here is a button. So the button is going to be this right here, button, 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 button. And what these buttons are is it's going to be type of button, and it's going to be disabled if is enabled. So if you are on the current page, so like it's going to disable the button based on what page you're on, and it's going to make logical sense if it's disabled or not. We're also going to have the on click, which this is actually the most important part. And the on click is going to be an asynchronous function, and it's going to call that trigger function, right? The trigger function from the useFormContext hook from React hook form. And this is going to look at the steps, right? It's going to look at the steps, and then we're going to use the current page index. So if we're on the first page, the current page index is 0. And then we're going to look at the inputs based on that current page. And then we are going to say should focus. So if it should focus, that means if there's an error, it's going to focus, and we put true. And if the response is not good, we're going to say toast.error, please fill the required fields and return. And then we're going to also set the page to the index. So this button is super important because this is going to validate if the inputs are good or not. And then what we have on the button is a class name. And then we are just dynamically rendering certain things. So if it has an error, so for example, let's act like we don't fill out any forms. You see it turns red, right? And that class name is right here where text red, and all of the text turn red inside of the localhost 3000. And we also have this right here. If the text is purple, and then if the opacity will be 50, then that means it's not on that current page. So as you can see, these opacities are 50%, and then this one is 100%. So you could play around with the code, see how everything looks, but everything will make sense when you go step by step like I am, and you'll fully understand the code. And then since we are mapping through everything, and this is the first element, we have to set the key to the step.id. And then inside of this button, right? So the button is going to end here. Let's see where it closes. So it's the whole return. Inside the button, we're going to have a p tag with the index +1. So it's going to be 0 + 1, so it'll be 1. And then the step title. So that is going to be rendered right here. So we have 1, the step title, 2, step title, 3, step title, 4, step title, 5, step title. And that is where we're rendering it inside the button, which is above this styles. And what we're going to do here is we are having a motion.div, right? And this motion.div is just going to pretty much give an animation based off of whether you are going forward or not inside of the page. So this button is a very important button for the form header. So that is it for the form header. It's very simple. Like I said, pause it if you need to, or go to the GitHub repo and copy all of this JSX, but there is no reason for me to type all of this. So let's go to the actual form footer now. The form footer is going to have a similar structure of what we just did with the form header, but just a little bit different. So inside of the form.tsx, under the form header, let's create another component called form footer. And we are also going to pass in the steps as well because we need to have access to them as a prop. So let's create a form footer inside the application form. So we're going to say form footer.tsx, just like this, RAFCE. Let's put this capital, make sure it's the right actual function name. And then we are going to take in the steps as a prop. And then this is going to be steps, and it's going to be type of step array. And let's make sure we import it here on the form.tsx so we have no errors. Okay, now let's look at the form footer, right? So the form footer is going to be these next and the next button and the back button, and it's always going to be on the bottom. So let's work on that right now. And inside the form footer, we are going to use the two hooks, which is the useFormContext with the trigger method. And we're also going to use the useFormControls, which is our custom hook for the React context so we can access all of the values. So first, let's use the form controls that we created, and let's invoke the function as well, the hook. And then we're going to use the handle back, handle next, has next page, has previous page, is final page, and the current page index. So all of these names make sense. And you do want to have these names make sense because then it's easy to understand what each of these are doing, right? And then with the other hook we're going to use is just going to be the useFormContext hook from React hook form. And what we're using in here is the trigger method or function. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is let's do a check. So we're going to say if is final page. We are going to render something here. And what we're going to render here is we're just going to render this specific back button, right? And we're going to use the Shatsian button. So let's import those as well. So if it is the final page, so we're on the submit page, we are just going to render this back button. And then we're also going to render a submit button with the type of submit. And as you remember, this whole form footer is inside of this form, right? So if the button is of type submit, that means it's going to call this on submit. If the button is of type button, it's not going to call this submit, and it's just going to keep going. So the form button, make sure this is of type submit, and make sure the back button is of type button. Very important, because if you don't do this, it's not going to work. So that is going to be if the page is the final page. Next is let me copy the JSX or the TSX for if it's not the final page. So if it's not the final page, it's going to return this instead. So we're going to have a button with the on click of handle back, and disabled if it doesn't have a previous page. So that means if you're on the first page, the back button is going to be disabled because there's no previous page. And then we're also going to have a button to handle the next page. And as you can see, we also have an on click with an asynchronous function that calls the trigger function from the useFormContext hook from React hook form. So this is going to validate all of the current inputs on the current page. And if it's not correct, we are going to throw an error, and you must actually validate all of the inputs before moving on to the next step. So this is going to be the form footer, and it should be rendering. So let's check out our localhost 3000. And as you can see, we have our form header and our form footer. And the reason why this background is white is if you actually go to the layout.tsx, what we can do here is, it's up to you guys if you want to do it or not. On the HTML, you could say class name, and then you could just have dark like this, and it should turn dark. So as you can see, now it's dark. And then if you don't want it to be dark mode, just remove this class name as dark. So now we've completed the form header and footer. Now it's time to actually move on to the form itself. We need to render each component that we created inside the steps folder. So that's going to be the address information, personal information, resume, uploaders, social links, and work experience. So these are the actual forms, right? And to do that, we're going to go in between the form header and the form footer. And we are going to create another component called render component, right? Name this whatever you want, but make sure you understand the name so it's easy to look at when you have to go back to the code. And this is going to be a self-closing tab. And what we want to do is now we want to create this render component.tsx file inside of your application form. So render component.tsx file, and we're going to do an RAFCE. Let's capitalize the R, and let's import it here. And then let's also accept these props that we're passing through as steps. So steps, and then of course type step is going to be step array like this. Okay, now let's actually work inside of the render component to display all of these components based on what step we are on, right? So to do that, what we're going to need is we're going to have to use the useFormControls hook. So we're going to say const equals use form controls hook like this. And we are going to use the current page index and the delta. And you're going to see how we're going to be using this delta. It's not too important. Like if you didn't have this variable, it's not going to change your code, but it does make your form look a lot sleeker and just way more professional looking as well. So what we're going to do here is we are going to say const step equals to the steps. So the steps we're getting from the props, and it's going to be the current page index, right? So that is going to be whatever step we're on, it's going to be stored in this variable, okay? Based off the current page index. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say const comp, which is component, equals to the step dot, and then we have a component, right? We have a property called component, and that component property, all it's doing is it is rendering the components we created here. So if we go back to the render component, we're going to store it inside the comp variable, which I have short for component. And we're going to say if there is no comp, right, then we are just going to return null like this. Okay, so in the return, what we're going to do is I'm going to copy over the TSX again and explain what's going on. And then you guys can pause the video to copy if you need to. So we're using a motion.div, right? So let's import motion at the top from framer motion. Now all of our errors are gone, and let's explain what's going on. So in the return, we have a motion.div, and we need the key property, which is going to be the current page index. So that's going to be a number. And then we're using framer motion's props. So we have the initial. So this is going to be the initial pretty much style of this specific div. So it's going to have an opacity of 0. And then the X, if the delta is greater than 0, we're going to have a 10% move initially. And then if it's not, it's going to be negative 10%. So the delta could either be greater than 0 or less than 0, which will be a negative number. And that is going to be depending on if you're going forward or backwards, because that delta equals the current page index minus the historic page index. So depending on it, it's going to be a 10% or negative 10% initial CSS value. We're also going to animate the opacity to 1 with the X of 0. We're going to have a transition to make it smooth. And we have some Tailwind CSS classes as well. And then above the actual component we're going to render, we are going to render a div displaying the step.title and the step.description with some CSS classes. And then if there is a component, we are going to render the comp, right? So the comp is going to be the component right here that is coming from here. So whatever this component is, it is rendering that. So let me go back to the render component, and that is going to be based off of the step that we are on, right? So whatever step the current page index is, it is going to render it based off of the component that the step is on. So it's that simple, right? So for example, let's go look at our code, let's refresh, and as you can see, it's personal information. So it's rendering that component, right? So we're rendering the title, the description, and the actual component. That is what's happening right here. Let me just zoom this in so you guys can see better. So title, description, component. If we try to click next, it's not going to work because technically we're calling that trigger function from the useFormContext, and it is saying that we haven't validated any of the inputs, which we haven't because we haven't actually worked on this component. So let's actually work on all the components for the steps to make this form look like an actual form. The first steps component is going to be the personal information, right? So let's go to that personal information.tsx file. All right now it is a empty array arrow function with nothing in it except for a div. So what we're going to do here is we are actually going to use the useFormContext hook. Like I said, this is for nested forms. And what we can do here is we can equal to the useFormContext like this. We're going to invoke it. And then let's use angle brackets so it knows what type it should be. So it's going to be a form schema type. And then closing angle bracket. And we're going to use the control, right? And this is going to be an object that contains methods for registering components into your React hook form. So we're going to be able to register all of these values into the form so then we can actually have access to it when we submit the form. So we're going to have a parent div like this, and let's do a class name, and let's do a width of full. We're going to do a grid calls 4, and a gap of 4 like that. And then we are going to start using some of the shadcn components from that form inside of here to actually style this. So I do want to go to shadcn and show you what I'm talking about real quick. So let's go shadcn UI. We're going to go to components. Let's make sure you can see it bigger. And let's go over to the form component. So this documentation is going to tell you how you could use the form that we've already used. We're about to use the form field. It's using Zod as well. And it shows you an example of what we're about to use right here. So this is the example we're about to use right here. And it shows you exactly what you need to do to use it. And it shows you the step-by-step on how you could use it. If you're doing a different form, that's a lot more simple. But this is using the React hook form behind the scenes, and using shadcn components as well. So let's minimize this and start working on it. So first we're going to have a form field like this. And this form field is going to be self-closing like this. And obviously we're going to get some errors thrown because we're not done with it. But first it's going to have a control. And that control is going to be equal to control from the useFormContext. So this is what's storing the value inside of the form that React hook form is using. Then we need to have a name attribute. And this name needs to equal one of the schema properties that you define. So as you can see, it has to equal this. It has to match. So first one is going to be the first name. Next is we're going to have a render, right? So this is what it's going to render inside of this form field. And what this is going to render is we're going to take in the field. And then this is going to be an arrow function like this. And then let's render what is going to be inside the form field. So first thing we could do is we have a form item. And this is coming from the app/components UI form. And this form item is going to have a class name of call span 2 like this. And then the form item is going to have some other elements inside of it. The first one is going to be a form label. So this is technically just a label. And this label is going to be whatever this input is. So mine's going to be first name. And let's make sure we import this. And this is coming from the same shadcn. And the last thing is let's use a shadcn input, or you could use a normal input if you want. And this input is going to be self-closing. And inside of this input, we're going to have a type attribute. So the type is going to be text for this one. We're also going to have a placeholder. We could have this as enter your first name. And then we also are going to have an ID. And this ID is going to be first name. I usually just match it up with the name attribute. So the same thing. And then we are going to use some spread syntax to spread throughout all of the field attributes that we're passing through the render. Okay, so now we're displaying the input here. And then underneath, we are going to make sure we have the form control. So this form control actually has to wrap the input. So let's wrap the input with the form control. And the reason why we need to wrap the input is because this form control is going to be able to get the control state like this, right? So, and then also let's put the form item outside of the form control. So there we go. So I kind of did that out of order, but what we have here is we have a form field that's self-closing. We have a control attribute, a name, and a render. The render is going to be what's displaying to the user. We're passing in a field attribute, and the field attribute is going to be all of these, as you can see if you hover over it, everything that we defined in the schema. And we're just passing all of the attributes of this field inside of the input. We also have a form control wrapping the input. So then whenever they type it in, it's going to be like a controlled state, and it's going to be stored inside of here and saved inside of the form context so that everything, when you submit it, it's going to have access to those values. We also have the form label and the form item. And then underneath the form control, inside of the form item, you could have a form description. And inside of this form description, you could just put a description of the input. So this is your public display name. Whatever you want to put there, you can. And then we could also have a form message, which this is going to show the error message based off of the schema that we did. And this is a self-closing tag like this. Okay, so this is it for the form field. This is going to be one input and field that the person is going to have to fill out. So this is the first name one. I'm just going to copy over the next one because it is literally the same process. So underneath this self-closing form field, let's paste the next one in. And as you can see, the next one is the last name with the same structure, right? As you can see here, same structure. We also have an email one. It is going to be the same structure as well. So here's the email. So now we have 3 form fields. And then we have a phone, right? So let's copy that one over as well. So they have to enter their phone. And then we also have this phone input. So we're going to import this from components/UI and then phone input. And this was part of the starter code. You could check out this component to see what's going on in here. But this is going to pretty much show you this. I'll show you exactly what this is doing. So it's doing this phone input right here. So it allows you to select a country and then type in your phone. So if we go back to the code, we're going to save everything. And you could put the default country to whatever you want. So like you could pick, hopefully they have US. They do. So the default country will be US. Okay, so let's save and make sure we are rendering it inside the form. So if we go inside the form, we are rendering the render component and passing in the steps. And then the render component is going to see what the current page index is and set the step to the current page index. And all we're going to do is get the step.component stored in the variable comp, which is short for component. And then we're going to render it here as well with an H2 and a P tag above the component. So everything looks like it should be working. Let's look at how it's going to look in ours. And as you can see, look at that framer motion. It's coming from left to right like that. So it's very nice, very sleek looking. The animations look good and the form is displaying. So what we can do here is, for example, if we try to click next, it is going to throw all of these errors, right? Because we are validating the form. Validation is very key when creating forms, and we made sure we set that up before actually creating the form. And now creating the form is the easy part. So as you can see, we're not allowed to go to the next step because of that trigger function from the useFormContext from the React hook form. So if we want to fill out this information, so we'll say Brett Westwood, brett@gmail.com. And we'll put some random number and we'll press next here. So next, it goes to the next step. You see, now everything is validated and we're on the next step, and this component we haven't done, and that's why it's just displaying this address information. Now let's work on the address information component. So inside of here, we're just going to go to address information, and right now all we have is just this div, and what we are going to do here is we are going to have a few different additional functions and functionality for this compared to the personal information. So the first thing is, let's use the form context, right, to get that control. So we're going to get const equals to the use form context from React hook form. And what we're going to get here is we're going to get the control, and we're also going to get this thing called set value. And the reason why we're getting this is because we are going to try to fetch their location based off of their computer's location. And inside this useFormContext, let's give it a type of form schema type like this with angle brackets. Perfect. So that is the hook we're using there. Another thing we need to use is we need to use some state. So we're going to say is autofill active. And then we're going to set is autofill active to useState. I like using the useState like this syntax. And initially it's going to be set as false. So this is going to be the autofill that we're going to try to set when it comes to their location, because this is the address information component, right? And the next thing we are going to use is we are going to use another function from React Hook Form, which is new. And this one is going to be the useWatch. useWatch is going to be a hook, and that is coming from the React Hook Form. So let me use watch. And actually, we could just import it in the same one up here. So we have the useFormContext. We also have useWatch. And we are going to be able to watch specific inputs without it having to pretty much, and it's going to isolate the re-rendering at the custom hook level and potentially result in a better performance for your application. So there is another thing called the watch API, which you can use, but the useWatch is going to be better for performance. So that's why we're using that one. And the fields we're going to watch, we have to define them here. So it's going to be country. And we're also going to watch the state. And we're going to equal to the useWatch. And then what we're passing inside of it is control, like this. And then we could just close this up and everything is good to go. So we're watching the country and the state from the useWatch. So as you hover over the useWatch, you can see all of the different fields that we could watch. Okay. Next is let's actually create the handle autofill function. So we're going to say handle autofill. And it's going to be an asynchronous function. And inside of this handle autofill, we're going to have a try catch. And first off, we are going to set is autofill active to true. Okay. So that is just pretty much going to allow us to set up a loader state. And next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the user's location, right? So get user's location. And to do that, we are going to say const position equals to await new promise. And then we are going to do angle brackets. We're going to do geolocation position, closing angle brackets. And then we're going to have a resolve and reject with the arrow function. And then we are going to close this as well, right? And inside of this asynchronous function, we are going to use the navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition and then resolve recheck like that. So this is going to be provided by JavaScript natively, and this is going to get the person's longitude and latitude coordinates based off of their computer. So if they have the location turned off on their computer, this isn't going to work. So you still want to give them the option to manually type the inputs for like their country and state. But this is going to help if they click the button and they want to autofill it in as well. So after we get this, we are going to destructure the latitude and longitude. Let me spell it right. And this is going to come from the position.chords. Okay. So if you want to, you can console log this position and see all of the objects and properties inside of the position variable. And what we can do here is we could just say const address equals to await. And we have a fetch address. And this is going to be a function inside of the lib folder, which we got from the starter code. So you can look at this function to see what's doing. And what we have to pass in here is the latitude and longitude. So this is just calling an API, and we could get their country, and we could also get their zip code based off of the latitude and longitude coordinates. So after we get the address, what we're going to do is we're also going to set the time zone as well. So we're going to say const time zone, just in case it didn't work in the initial value. We're going to set this to the same JavaScript method that we did inside of the default values of the form.tsx. And now we're going to use the set value that we're getting from the form context to now set the values of a specific input. So the set value is going to take in some parameters. So the parameters for the first one is either going to be like name, last name, email, phone, country. So these are going to be the keys of and the values of the inputs. So the first one we could do is we could do country like this, and this as a comma. Now we have to give it the actual value. So we're going to get the address that we're getting from this specific API fetch dot country like that. And then next is we're going to set the value to the zip as well. So zip, and then the zip is going to be address dot zip like this. And for some reason, you should be able to set the address as well, but it isn't working. So if anybody in the comments wants to try to debug why this fetch address function isn't working, you can, but you should be able to get the country and the zip from this API and then set the value of these inputs here. Okay, and then let's go into the catch of the try catch, and let's just set a console.log of error inside of here. And then let's also have a finally. And in this finally, oh, I'm not doing the right spot. Let's do the finally. So no matter what, we're going to set the is auto active fill to false. So that all it's doing is just pretty much removing the loading state, because we do need to set it to false because we did set it true up here. So this is the handle autofill function to handle the autofill. And next is we can work on the actual form inside of the return here. So what we're displaying to the user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy most of this over, because this is going to be almost the same as the personal information.tsx. So let me copy one by one, because I feel like that'd be the best way you guys can learn. First, let me copy the parent div. So this is step 2 of the form, where we're getting all of their address information, and we're going to utilize the same syntax that we did for step 1 of the personal information, with a few additional changes and a little more detailed when it comes to this specific step. So first off, I am going to copy most of the code, and I'll explain it as we go. So I'm going to copy the first one, which is the form field, and this form field is obviously a single input or field for the form that we are storing the state in. So let's import all of this, and the form field is coming from shatcn, the form item, form label, form control, the shatcn input, the shatcn button. We're getting this loader 2 from Lucid React, the map pin from Lucid React, and the form message from shatcn. So let's explain what's going on. So we have this form field, and we are storing the values in a controlled input, and then we're giving it a name attribute of address, and then we have this render prop that is going to show the UI to the user. We have the form item with the form label. We have a form control wrapping in an input with a type address. We have a placeholder, some class names, and ID. And then right underneath the input, we do have a button. So this is of type button, and we're utilizing an on click, calling the handle autofill function that we just created up here, calling the JavaScript geolocation API. So this is going to allow them to click this button, and it is going to autofill the country and the zip code for them. And then we have a loader state for if the autofill is active or not. And if it's active, it's showing a loader. If not, it's going to show the map pin. And then we are displaying the form message if we get an error on this specific input. Okay. And we're going to look at all this when this is done, because if you actually go to localhost 3000, you have to fill out the personal information before you could even look at step 2. So let's fill out all the inputs, then check to see if everything looks good. So we have the first form field done. Let me copy over the second one. And the second input is going to be the country. So this country is actually not going to be an input. It's going to have a select. So it's going to be a select from shatcn. So let's first import everything. And then after we import this, let me just explain what's going on. So I imported all the selects from shatcn. Now I'm going to import this country names. And this country names is coming from the lib folder where the starter code is. And it is just a JSON file with a list of countries. So make sure you have the starter code so you could have this as well. So we do have a form field and we have the same attributes and everything. But like I said, inside the form control, we do have a select. And we have an on value change and a value that is associated with the select. And on the value change, we are calling this function on country change, which we have not created. So we're going to create this, and I'm going to explain why we're creating this function. And what we're doing in here is we're passing the value in as a argument into this function, and we're making sure it's lowercase so we don't get any errors. If something's capitalized and something's not, it might throw an error. And then we're also passing in the field attribute, which is getting passed through the render as well. So let's create this on country change at the top. So const on country change. And what this is going to take in, it's going to take in the two props that we just passed in, which is going to be the value, which is a string, and it's going to take in the field. So it's going to be the key that we're looking at, and it's going to be of type controller render props. And then we could do form schema type, comma, and then this first one is going to be country. We're looking at and dealing with the country field key. So that's why we're just going to use that and make sure it is type checked before we actually run this function. And next, what we're going to do is we're going to do the field dot onChange, and we're going to set it to the value. So this is us pretty much getting the value and storing it inside the React hook form whenever we select a country. And then what we have to do here is we have to set the value of the state to an empty string. And then we also need to set the value of the city to an empty string as well. Because if they do change the country, we do have to reset these two specific selects or inputs. So what we could do now is we could scroll down and we can see that everything for the country form field is correct and ready to go. So we can move on to the third form field, which is going to be the state. So let's copy this over, paste it below this div, and we are going to look at what's happening here. Pretty much the same format. We're using a select, we have an on value change, and we also have a disabled attribute, and we're going to say that the field is disabled if the field is not disabled or if there's no country. So if they haven't selected a country, they're not going to be able to select a state because we're going to determine the state list, because as you can see, we're mapping through it based off the country they select. So if we import the country, this is coming from our libs folder, and we have this on state change function that we do need to create. So let's create this real quick up here above all of the return. So we're going to have a const on state change. This is going to take in the same stuff. It's going to take in the value as a string, and then it is going to be, the field is going to be of type controller render props. It's going to be the form schema type, and it's looking at the state key. What we're going to do here is all we need to do is do a field dot on change, which is setting the state to the, and it's setting it as the value. And then we're going to set the value of the city to an empty string. So if they change the state, we need to reset the city input or select form. So if we scroll down, everything looks good. We have no errors. So the next one we need to do is the city. So now let's get the city and copy and paste it down below. So if we look at the city, we're going to have this disabled if there's no country or no state, because we want to make sure they select that before selecting a city. This is going to be a select as well, not an input. And they're going to be able to select from a list of cities that we're just mapping through and displaying the city name inside of the select item. The next input is going to be the zip code. This one is very straightforward, not much to it. It is going to be a form field with an input, and they're going to be able to type in their zip code, or it's going to be auto-filled if they click the button. And the last form field for step 2 of the form is going to be the time zone. So the time zone is always going to be disabled, as you can see here. And the reason why is because we could always get the time zone based on the user's device, because they're not going to be able to block access to this, but they can block access to the geolocation API, but they can't block access to us getting the time zone. So their time zone is going to auto-populate inside of this specific input. Okay, so now let's see how this actually looks. Let's fill out step 1 real quick. And let's see how step 2 looks. Okay, perfect. So step 2, we have the address, we have the country. We can't select the state until we get the country. So let's do United States, where I'm from. We can select a state, but we can't select a city. Perfect. So let's select Florida. And then I am in Tampa. So let's see if we could get Tampa. And then we can select Tampa. Awesome. And then let's see if we could auto-populate. And this should just update the zip code and the country, which it does. I mean, the country didn't change because I reselected it. And then you just have to fill out the address. And then the time zone, as you can see, is disabled, and it auto-populated my time zone here, which is America/New York. If we try to click next, it's going to say a validation error. It was on this specific input, so we do need to fill this out. So let me just put 123 Main Street. And let's see if we could continue now. So now we could continue to step 3. So that means step 2 is completely done and ready to go. We are going to be introducing a new hook from the React Hook Form library, and this is called the useFieldArray. And this is going to be a custom hook for working with dynamic forms. So the work experience section is going to be dynamic because we are giving them the option to add more than one job inside of their application. So for example, let's go look at what we're making. We are going to be able to add a job number 1, and we could also add job number 2, job number 3, and so on. And then we could also remove them as well. So this is dynamic, which we are going to take advantage of this useFieldArray. It is going to provide a better user experience and performance for the client. So let's define the hook at the top and initialize it. So to do that, what we're going to say is we're going to have const equals the useFieldArray coming from React Hook Form. And what this is going to take in as arguments or props is we're going to have control to control the actual state and the values. And then we're going to have name, and we're just going to have it as jobs because that is the name we named it, right? So what we're going to do here is we are going to pass and return the fields, and we're going to pass the append and remove as well. So what we're going to do now is we are going to use the useFormContext as well, that hook. And to use the useFormContext, let's just initialize it as well. So useFormContext. And let's define the type of this. This is going to be the form schema type with angled brackets. And what we're going to return here is we're going to return the control. And then we're also going to return the form state. And so we could display the errors from the form state. Okay, so inside of the div, this is a very important thing. So first, you're going to have to include the key with the field IDs because each field is considered a different pretty much dynamic item, if you want to think of it like that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a parent div, and inside of it, we're going to have a class name. Let's do space y6. And we are going to map through all the fields, and the fields we are getting from is from the useFieldArray. And we're going to map through it. This is going to take in the field and the index. And let's render out a job component, which we haven't created yet. And this job component is going to have a key equal to the field.id. So as you can see, if you press dot, you can see field.company.description.from, ID, title, and to. So it is taking all of the inputs from this specific step that we're working on and storing it inside of the field. So first we have the field ID. Then we're going to pass in the actual input values. Well, the input keys. Field equals field. The index is going to equal the index. And remove will equal remove. And errors will equal errors like this. But we don't need it, so we're going to remove this for now, the errors. And we're just going to keep it like this. And then underneath this, we are going to render a p tag. And we're going to say if there's errors dot jobs, then we are going to display errors dot jobs dot message like this, or null. Okay, so this is going to be the first return, and we are just, like I said, mapping through all of the fields that we're getting from the useFieldArray. And the useFieldArray is looking at this specific step, so it's step 3. And what it is doing, it is getting the states from it. So if you hover over fields, you could see that step 3 has these specific inputs of field dot company, description, from, ID, title, and to. And those are all of the fields that are associated with step 3. So underneath this, let's have a button. We could just do a regular HTML button. And inside of this button, let's do a plus circle, and let's have a class name, size of 4, margin right of 2. Let's do self-closing, and we're just going to say add job. So this is the button we want to click. We want to add a job. So we need an on-click on this button to perform some logics. So we're going to have an on-click. We could do the arrow function right here. And what we're going to do inside the arrow function is we're going to use append from the useFieldArray. And what this does, it is going to just create another pretty much section of the field, right? So it's going to create another job for them to add to their resume. So inside of the append, we are just going to define the initial values of the title, the company, the to, the from, all that kind of good stuff. So we're going to define the title, which is going to be empty string, company, which is also an empty string, from, we could just do new date like this. To, we're going to do new date as well, and description, empty string like that. So when we click this button, we are creating another job field for them to fill out. So this is going to be it for that specific component with the work experience, but we do need to create this job component. So what we can do is just right below this yellow bracket above the export default, we can actually create a const job, and let's see what it is taking in, what we're passing in as props. We are passing in the index, remove, and the field, right? So what we can do here is we could do index, comma, remove, and let's define the types. So index is going to be of type number. Remove is going to be pretty much a function that takes in the index, which is of type number, and it doesn't return anything, so it's void, like that. And the other thing we're going to take in, we could define here is the field, and then we could use type of record, like this. So field, we have record, and then we do the angled brackets. We're looking at the ID, and it's going to be a type string, like this. And then what we can do here is we can add field as well. Did I spell it wrong? Oh, I'm just using commas. I should not be using commas. Let me redo this real quick. Okay, so something's happening here. Let me just copy and paste it. I don't know why it is throwing errors. Maybe I just typed everything wrong real quick. But let me just copy and paste this over. Okay, so that's better. So we have the index and the remove, and then we're just defining the types here. And we have this arrow function, and we're using the useFormContext to get this control object right here. And what we're going to do is let's just do a closing bracket so we get no more errors. And let's have a return. So this is going to be where we define all of the form fields. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this all over, because all of these are going to be pretty much me repeating myself and sounding very repetitive. So I am going to copy every form field over. And if you guys do want to look through the code, you're more than welcome to. All the form fields you do is it's going to either use an input, a select, or a popover, right? So, and all of these are from ShatCN. So I'm just going to paste this all in. And then all you have to do is make sure you import these from the components folder until you get no more errors, right? So we have a text error that we're using for one of them. This is the description. Let's scroll up and see what we're doing. We have a popover for another one, right? And this is going to be for picking a date. So let's import all of this. We also have this format, and this should be coming from the utils file. Let's see. Let's see where this is coming from. Oh no, this is coming from a package called datefns. So do we have it auto imported? Yes, format right here. So datefns. We also have a calendar icon from Lucid React. We have CN. We spelled popover wrong, so let's make sure that's spelled right. Popover content. We're also using the ShatCN calendar to display them able to pick the from and to date. Let's scroll up. Let's do the input. Let's also get this trash can icon from Lucid React, and we just have errors on this motion. So let's import motion. And this is coming from Framer Motion. So like I said, I know I copied a lot of stuff over, but there is a GitHub repository in the description below. Just look over it, see what I'm doing. I'm doing pretty much the same thing I just explained, but like I said, if I typed all this out, this video is going to be 4 hours long by the time we're done. So step 4 is just going to be 2 inputs asking for social links. So that is going to be the GitHub profile and a personal portfolio. They're both going to be URLs that are going to be typed in a input. So let's create these social links. And what we're going to do is we are going to use the useFormContext and a few other hooks like use callback from React to make sure we use the debounce methods, so we're not always fetching an API on every keystroke, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to copy some of this stuff over, and we are going to explain what's going on. Let me just copy this. And then let me import all of the components or packages that we need so this could actually run effectively. So the debounce is coming from the lib folders. The use callback is from React. The fetch page metadata is coming from the utils folder. So if you want to check that out, I recommend checking that out because that was part of the starter code. The fetch GitHub profile, that's just an API call. And this is just pretty much an API call as well. We're going to get the use state hook. We're going to get the useFormContext from React Hook Form. We have a page metadata type. We also have a GitHub profile as well. So now we have everything ready to go. As you can see, we're using the useFormContext hook. We're using the control and get values, right? We're also having state to set the GitHub data and the GitHub data. And then we have the set portfolio data as well for the use state. We're using a debounce method to fetch both the GitHub and page metadata because, like I said, you don't want to fetch on every keystroke. We're waiting at least 1 second before actually calling this specific API call. And then we also have a use effect. So whenever any of these values change, or when we make a change to it, we are rendering this function to see if all of this is working correctly. Okay, so let's copy and paste over where the field form is. And what we have to do now is we have to import all of the form fields and the form items from Shadcn. Let's also import the input. Animate presence is coming from Framer motion. And then now you're going to see that we do have two things we're not going to be able to fill in. We have a GitHub preview, and we also have a portfolio preview. So what this is saying is if there is portfolio data, that means somebody actually submitted a URL, or if there's a GitHub data, which means somebody submitted a URL and input, we need to show a preview of how their profile looks. So what I'm going to do is inside of the application form, we are going to create a file called GitHub profile.tsx and profile preview.tsx. So GitHub profile.tsx. And I'm just going to copy this code over. This really has nothing to do with the React hook form. I don't want to take away from the main video's purpose. And what this is doing, it is just getting props from the GitHub API, like avatar URL, the login, the bio, and is displaying it in a very modern way with an image and Framer motion. So what we can do here is we could just import that now. And the last one we have to do is the portfolio preview. So let's create a file inside the application form called portfolio preview.tsx. And it is going to be the same concept. What we're doing here is instead we are getting the title, the description, and the image inside of the function, and we're displaying it in a nice way. So as you can see, we're spreading through all of the attributes and values of the portfolio data, and we are setting the portfolio data to this handle portfolio change. And what we're doing is just debouncing the fetched metadata, calling it up here, getting the API call, and making sure that we get all of the metadata back for a specific URL, and same thing with the GitHub. Okay, so step 4 is now complete, and everything should be working. And I know I'm going through step 3 and 4 pretty fast, but like I said, you could pause the video, and you're going to have to look at the GitHub repo to understand what's really going on and copy some of this stuff. Because like I said, I'm not going to be here for 4 or 5 hours just typing. The video will be really drawn out, and it's not worth it for me to type every single piece of code. Especially when this video is more towards a tutorial of the React hook form and not of how to use the GitHub API. So hopefully you guys understand. And if you guys are still here throughout the video watching from the beginning, thank you so much. I know we're probably close to 2 hours in, so that just shows a lot of dedication, and thank you guys for supporting this channel. And if you guys haven't already, hit that like button and also subscribe for more content just like this. We're going to be releasing a new topic video every week. But other than that, let's jump into the final step. So the resume uploader is where the user is allowed to upload a PDF file or their resume using the React drop zone library. And I don't want to go too much in detail with the React drop zone. I'm just going to copy and paste the code, and you guys can see exactly how we're using it within the form field. And that is the main thing I want to actually emphasize in this specific video. There's going to be a time in the future where I am going to create a whole video about React drop zone, but this video is not the time for that. So what we can do is I copied everything over real quick. So let me just get the right import paths for these specific variables. And what we're doing here is we are using the useFormContext to get the control, the get field state, and the form state. And then we have one single form field, right, with the form item and form control. And the form control this time isn't wrapping input or select, it's wrapping a drop zone input, right? So if we look inside of the components, UI/drop zone, we are pretty much using the, the React drop zone library right here. So we use drop zone hook, and we are just making sure we check all the types, seeing all of the on value changes, seeing if there's an on drop, seeing if there's the files.length plus the value.length is greater than the max files. We're doing a bunch of checks in here, and we're also rendering how the drop area should be using Tailwind. So there is a bunch of checks in here with a bunch of types. Like I said, I mean, this is 160 lines of code, and this is just defining the drop zone area. And then we are using it here, and we're passing it in a bunch of props like the value, which is going to be the field.value, right? And the on value change is going to be the field.onChange. And the max files is going to equal the max files. The allowed extensions is going to be stored inside this valid resume file extensions. So if you see I hover over it, these are all the extensions that are valid. We have a max resume size in bytes. This is going to be of type number. And multiple files, we're going to say the max files is going to be 2. Okay, so that is it for the 5 different steps. So what I'm going to do here is we are going to test everything out and see if everything works. And if the submit button works at the end, all it's going to do is console log all of the values, right? So we have this form, and we have this on submit, and this on submit is just console logging the values. So let's test everything out. Let's refresh this page. And what we're going to do is we're going to type in my name and an email. And let's say, for example, we forget to do the phone. We click next. We can't move on to the next step. So perfect. So let's fill out the phone. Now let's click next, and it allows us, let's do the address. Let's use the autofill functionality. Let's get my state and city. We could just do tarmac, it's not a big deal. And then we have the time zone already filled out for us. So let's click next. Let's add a job. So what we can do here is we have to add a job first. So we could say developer Inc. Corp. Let's just do the from date December 3rd till January 13th and worked on code. Let's just say that. And then if we want to add a job, we can. If not, we could just press X. Let's press next. And now let's do the GitHub profile. But there is going to be a issue. It looks like we are getting this error. So let's go and fix that. Even though we haven't filled out the fields, let's see why we are getting that error. Okay, so I don't want to remove it from the video, even though I did make a mistake. And I do want to show why that mistake is happening. So when we do click the add job button, it throws all of these errors. And the reason why is because that add job button, we didn't put it as type of button. So type needs to equal button. So by default, it's going to be submit if it's wrapped inside a form. So that means it's trying to submit the form, and it's trying to validate all the inputs, which it's showing red. So it's like, hey, you need to make sure that these are the correct data type and structure, and that's why it's showing it for the rest of the form, because we haven't filled out yet and they think we're trying to submit the form. So let's have a type of button. And then also I do want to add some Tailwind CSS to this button. So I'm just going to copy that over and add this as well. So now let's test it out to make sure everything is working. So let's refresh. Let's put my name, some random email. Let's say next, a random address. Just selecting the first one of everything. Random zip code. And now when we do work experience, if you click add, as you can see now, it's not trying to check the other inputs to see if it's the correct type or not. It is just letting me do it because it's not of type submit anymore. So let's try developer, Inc. Corp. Let's choose the from date to be 2, and then make sure it's the from date is less than the to date, and said worked on code. And if you want to add another job, you can, or if not, you can remove it as well. Let's click next. Now we have the GitHub profile. So let's test this out to make sure the API fetch is working, which it should be. So what we're going to do here is we are going to go to your profile. We're going to click copy. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paste it in. It's going to fetch. Okay, now there's an invalid source prop on the next/image. So that means we have to go inside of our next.config.ts and add that inside of the remote pattern. So let's go over there real quick. So it did fetch it properly, but it's trying to display this image from GitHub usercontent.com, and it doesn't trust it. So that means we have to tell Next.js, hey, you need to trust a specific URL because it is safe with us. So I'm going to paste that in here. So we're going to have images, remote patterns, protocol HTTPS, that specific URL, and the path name could be anything like this after it. So we're going to save this. And what we're going to have to do here is I'm hoping we don't have to restart the server, but let me just restart the development server just in case. Because usually when you make a change to like a next.config file, you need to reset your development server, development. So we're going to wait for this to run, and we will test it out again. So this is another important thing is when you're doing code, like you're probably going to run into issues, and there's nothing to be mad about or upset that you're running into issues through your code. That is pretty much the whole basis of code, is trying to solve problems and create useful things for people, right? So first name, last name, email, we're going to click, okay, that's not the right US phone number, so let's try it again. So as you can see, that validation is working. Any country is fine. Maybe not Antarctica. Let's type in a random zip code, and we have the time zone. Let's add some job. We're just going to say coded. Let's try the social links again. So I'm just going to take what I have from my copy. So here we go. Let's paste it. And as you can see, we are fetching all of the correct stuff from my profile. So let's try my little website that I have, DevVibe Studio. And let's paste it here and see if it fetches the metadata. And it does. So it's fetching everything perfectly. So we're going to click next. And here is the React drop zone. So let's see if we could like upload a resume. And as you can see, we're uploading it and displaying it as well. And let's inspect the console and see if we are console log and everything. So let's press submit, and we have the console. So perfect. So we have the first name, we have the last name, we also have email and phone. So we have address, we also have a country, state, city, zip code, time zone. We also have jobs as an array of 1. We also have the portfolio and the GitHub link. And then we also have the resume as a file. So we are console logging and getting all of the values from the form, even though it's in multiple files, right? And the reason why is mainly because of the useFormContext hook that React hook form allows us to use. So I know this was a super long video when it comes to React hook form. I'm actually going to come out with other smaller videos going over more specific things, but this is a very good video to watch to help you create a really advanced form when it comes to any kind of form you need. If it's an onboarding form, if it is a job application form, whatever form it may be, hopefully this video is going to help you and get you on the right path. And if you guys haven't already, you could join my Discord room. We will be going live every Saturday and answering questions based on the topic of that week or the previous weeks. So definitely join the Discord room. That will be in the link in the description. And before you guys go, hit that like button. Also subscribe for more content just like this. And next week we will be going over a different topic. But this week, whenever this video is uploaded, it is going to be all about the React hook form. So thank you guys again for sticking around, and hope you guys have a great day and happy coding.